Imagine committing the perfect murder. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no one even suspects you. You walk back into the city. The sun is still shining. The world hasn't changed, but something has. Now imagine realizing that the real prison was never the police. It was your own mind. Because in Crime and Punishment, the question isn't, will he get caught? It's this: what happens when a human being tries to prove he's above morality and discovers he isn't built to survive it? This isn't a detective story. It's a psychological breakdown. And the punishment starts long before the law ever gets involved. So, I want you to just hold on to this question as we go through this. Just let it sit in the back of your mind. What if the brutal murder of the old pawnbroker isn't actually the start of the story? What if it's the final act of a punishment that's been going on the whole time? The crime itself, the acts, it's almost a footnote. The real action, the true violence in this book, it all happens inside the mind of one man, our protagonist, Rodion Raskolnikov. See, this book isn't about getting caught. It's about the absolute impossibility of living with a certain kind of idea once it's taken root. And to really get a handle on this internal war, you have to understand the man who dreamed it all up. Dostoevsky didn't just pull these themes of suffering and psychological torture out of thin air. No, he lived them. He lived them in the most harrowing way imaginable. Look at this timeline. This isn't just a list of bad things that happened to a guy. This is a forging. He gets arrested for what was basically a political book club. He's sentenced to death, literally dressed in a death shroud and tied to a post waiting to be shot. Then, at the very last second, a reprieve. But it's followed by years of brutal hard labor and a lifetime of violent epilepsy. This is the furnace where his ideas were born. I mean, can you even imagine the psychological weight of that moment? Dostoevsky became completely obsessed with what goes on inside the mind of a person who knows for a fact they are about to die. He experienced the ultimate punishment without ever committing a capital crime. And that experience, well, that's the key that unlocks this entire novel. So Dostoevsky takes this incredible, profound experience of condemnation and just hands it to his character, Raskolnikov. But here's the twist. Raskolnikov gets there, not because the state puts him there, but because of his own intellectual pride. He cooks up this theory, an experiment in what it means to be human. This whole thing hinges on a theory from an article Raskolnikov himself wrote. It basically says the world is split into two kinds of people. You've got the ordinary folks, the herd who have to obey the rules, and then you have the extraordinary few, the geniuses, the Napoleons. And there, he argues, have an inner right to step over any obstacle, even as he says, to step over blood if it's for some greater purpose, the murder. That's his test to prove to himself which group he belongs to. And this is where it all just completely falls apart. On one side, you have his theory. It's all cold, clean, intellectual logic. But the reality of the crime, oh man, it's a hot, feverish, chaotic mess. He sees himself as this calculating Napoleon, but in the moment, he's just filled with what the book calls a dull animal rage. He thinks he's in control, but he only gets away with it because of pure dumb luck. Even thinking to himself, when reason fails, the devil helps. The gap between his idea and the actual man is just masked. And it's in that gap, that massive chasm, that Dostoevsky reveals his deepest insight. See, he's not really writing about a philosopher who commits a crime. He's writing about how philosophy itself, how pure reason, shatters the second. It comes into contact with the messy, irrational reality of being a human being. Think about this. Before he even commits the murder, his own body is already punishing him. It's an open rebellion against his so-called irrational plan. He's shivering, feeling cold in the suffocating summer heat of St. Petersburg. His body is a perfect mirror for his mind falling apart. He is quite literally sick with his own idea. This isn't the mind of some criminal mastermind, is it? This is a man coming unglued. The great thinker, the guy who wrote the extraordinary man theory, can't even remember what he was just thinking or where he's walking. His rational intellect, the very thing his whole experiment depends on, is totally failing him. And then you get this bizarre little detail. On his way to commit a murder, Raskolnikov starts thinking about the placement of fountains in the city squares. This isn't just a random thought, it's a brilliant psychological observation. In moments of extreme stress, the mind often just checks out. It dissociates. It flees into the most mundane, trivial things. Dostoevsky knew that with a chilling intimacy. So ultimately, the book just demolishes this idea that we are rational creatures. Raskolnikov's punishment starts way before the crime because his own humanity, his fever, his contradictions, his shivering body, is the punishment for trying to live his life as a cold, abstract idea. Okay, so this brings us to one of the most common, and I think one of the most important misreadings of the novel. And it's this assumption that the story is about Raskolnikov feeling guilty, and that when he finally confesses, he gets some kind of relief. But Dostoevsky is so much more subtle and so much more unsettling than that. The confession to the police. That's not the climax of the book. It's almost a side note. The real story, the story of the true punishment and the faint possibility of redemption, that all happens much, much later in the epilogue when he's in a Siberian prison camp. Get this, even in Siberia, after he's confessed, he is not suffering from guilt. The book says he is physically sick from wounded pride. It's explicit he would have been happy if he could just blame himself, if he could feel remorse for the murder. But he can't. He's still trapped inside his theory. This line lays it all there in his mind. His real crime wasn't killing 2 women. No, his crime was that he failed. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't a Napoleon. He got sick, he got scared, and he confessed his sin in his own eyes as his own weakness. And that's the real source of all his suffering. The prison chains, the hard labor, that's nothing to him. The real prison is the terrible, impossible gulf that exists between him and every other person. The other prisoners, actual murderers, they can sense it. They hate him, not because he killed someone, but because he's a gentleman who sees them as lice, just like he saw the pawnbroker. His idea has literally cut him off from the human race. That is the punishment. So if the punishment isn't the legal sentence, and the crime isn't really the murderer, and the suffering isn't guilt, then what in the world is this book actually about? Well, I think it all boils down to this one raw, elemental realization that hits Raskolnikov before he even turns himself in. And this is the moment his entire intellectual house of cards just collapses. After all his big ideas about great men in the right to kill, he's faced with this simple primal animal instinct. Life, any kind of life at any cost, is better than death. Not a good life, not a purposeful life, just being alive. That raw biological fact. And it's an idea that's more powerful than any philosophical book he's ever read. And that's where Dostoevsky leaves us. Raskolnikov has this breakthrough, this raw, almost animal realization that life, any life, is precious. That simply existing matters. But the novel quietly asks something more unsettling. Is survival enough? Is clinging to your small square yard of space enough? Or does truly living require something harder? Something humbling? Does it mean admitting you are not extraordinary? Does it mean choosing connection over pride? Does it mean surrendering the ideas that isolate you from everyone else? Dostoevsky doesn't close the case neatly. He doesn't hand us redemption in a bow. He leaves the question hanging. For Raskolnikov, and for us. Because at some point, every one of us has to decide, are we going to live above humanity or inside it? If you enjoyed this deep dive into crime and punishment, hit the like button. It really helps the channel. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns that go beyond the plot and into the psychology behind these classic books. And I want to hear from you. Do you think Raskolnikov truly changes by the end? Or is the redemption still unfinished? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me which book you want us to dissect next.